Hello, everyone. It is 7 o'clock, so we are going to get started with our evening session, which is the pinnacle of any convention, the keynote speech and the acceptance speeches. Again, my name is Jack Chernin. I'm the coordinator for the convention, and we've had a lot of good speakers over the course of the weekend, a lot of good discussion about the future of the party, and I'm very excited about our 3 speakers tonight who are going to lay out a great vision for the future. Our first speaker is our keynote speaker, Leah Libresco Sargeant. Leah is a freelance writer covering religion, statistics, and theater. Her writing has appeared in First Things, America, The American Conservative, Commonweal, The American Interest, and others. Leah is the author of Arriving at Amen, 7 Catholic prayers that even I can offer, which tells the story of how she learned to pray. Her second book, Building the Benedict Option, is a guide to building thicker Christian community. She's spoken on CNN, at Theology on Taps in multiple countries, and at Chicago Ideas Week. She has been a public policy researcher, a news writer for 538, the HR lead for a remittance company, and a curriculum developer for the Center for Applied Rationality. She runs the Substack Other Feminisms and works at Braver Angels. So let's give it up for our keynote speaker.
Thank you so much for coming out here, for being here to support Peter and Lauren. I'm really pleased to talk to you tonight. And I want to start with the obvious question. A third party run, a third party at all, always raises the question, is this realistic? Is this reasonable? Now, as a former supporter, as a teenager, of Dennis Kucinich, I know something about voting as an act of hope, but I also know something about not seeing that hope bear any obvious fruit. But as much as the American Solidarity Party faces, rightly, questions about what we hope to accomplish and how, there's another question about who's really being reasonable that our party rightly turns back out at the so-called mainstream political parties. How reasonable can our parties and our politics be if they don't start with an honest account of the human person? What I want to talk to you about tonight, and the choice I see the American Solidarity Party presenting, is the choice between a false politics of autonomy and an honest politics of dependence. Here we are, the day after a Supreme Court decision on forgiving student debt, where our president made a clumsy attempt to reckon with who we ask to bear the cost of our misaligned administrator-serving college system. Here we are in the middle of a rolling Medicaid purge where over 1.5 million vulnerable people have been kicked off the Medicaid rolls, have lost their health insurance, not because they were ruled to be ineligible, but because they didn't assemble the burdensome documentation in time by a sudden, arbitrary, semi-announced deadline. Here we are in a border state, as families faced heightened barriers to claiming asylum, face the burden of not even able to face an asylum officer to make their case at all. And as people around the world are vulnerable, our nation makes it impossible to come the right way through a system of metering, limited appointments, and a refugee cap. Here we are, 1 week after the anniversary of the Dobbs decision, in a nation still turning over the question about whether a baby is a wholly different nature of being than a woman. In the womb, at the border, in sickness, in debt, our politics see need as a sign that something has gone wrong. On each issue, one party may try to fix blame, while the other applies a Band-Aid fix, as though need were a passing problem, something we need a brief stopgap measure to get over, but not a reality we reckon with throughout our entire lives. Our parties trade places. Republican states treating migrants and refugees as insidious invaders. Meanwhile, Democrats plead for children separated from their parents at the border, but say there should be no limits on mother-child separation in the womb. We face a choice of cages or curettes. That's not a reasonable choice. It's not realistic to accept that as our choice. What does a real alternative look like? The politics of dependence begin by acknowledging that dependence is our default state, not autonomy. Self-sufficiency is the brief, passing aberration. Each of us begins our life in an attitude of total dependence on one person in particular, on our mother in the womb. And after birth, a baby is no less dependent than they were in the moments before they emerged. Their dependence is just more easily shared among a number of other people who love them and feel responsibility for them. And as we grow, each of us slips into periods of greater dependence on others. Our vice presidential candidate a little more obviously and visibly tonight with her sprain and her boot. And that's not a strange passing moment that alienates her from her true self. It's a default of dependence that we return to at greater or lesser intensity throughout our lives until, if we are very lucky, we are old enough to be critically dependent on the people we love once again, as vulnerable as a child, and God willing, with people we can trust in the unconsidered way that a child trusts their mother. But a world that holds up independence as the ideal is a world that asks us to be untruthful to ourselves. It gives us two rival duties: to obscure our dependence and to resent it. We have to advocate for the needy on the basis of their need, not rounding them up or rounding that need off because we find it awkward to acknowledge or shameful to bear. One of the most compelling portraits I've seen of what a politics of dependence looks like, of what realism looks like in an unrealistic culture, came from O. Carter Snead in his book, What It Means to Be Human. And this was something I found really striking because I've often heard advocacy for the unborn framed as a way of rounding babies up to grown-ups. An advocacy that starts with all the ways that a child in the womb is similar to a grown-up. Did you know that this baby has already developed their heart? Did you know that this baby, as of 18 or 20 weeks, can see light passing through the mother's body and can respond to that light, just like a person? Did you know that this baby has fingernails, just like a person? This kind of reasonable to point out these facts in a society that neglects them, but this kind of anxious, don't worry, the baby is almost the same as you, almost as strong as you, almost as capable as you. And in his book, Snead inverts the analogy. He doesn't say the baby is like the mother, almost as good, almost as autonomous, almost as worthy of being treated as real. He says the mother is like the baby. He acknowledges what it can be tempting to cover up, that the baby's need creates a neediness in the mother, that by virtue of supporting someone else, she herself becomes weaker, needs more from others. And what Snead does is he analogizes the way that the mother in justice responds to her child and responds to that child's need to the way we all around her, starting with her partner and then the broader community around them, have to respond to that need with an inrushing of support. He says the mother is like the baby, needy, dependent, unable in many cases to support herself utterly alone. And usually, when we compare someone to a baby, we think of that as an insult. It's infantilizing, a negatively valenced word, because we think a baby is something bad to be, or good to be only insofar as eventually they will cease to be a baby. But Snead has it the right way around. The pattern set for us in our infancy is the pattern that will follow us our entire lives. And a politics that has no room for babies will ultimately have no room for people, because each of us will resemble the dependency of the infant at various points in our life. And what Sneed writes, and I really love this quote, is, "Law and policy, animated by an anthropology of embodiment, would view the mother as a vulnerable, dependent member of society who is entitled to the protections and support of the network of uncalculated giving and graceful receiving that must exist for any human being to survive and flourish." What does that look like in practice, that network of uncalculated giving and grateful receiving? In her book, Motherhood, A Confession, Natalie Carnes explores her own maternity through the lens of Augustine's Confessions. And she has one passage that really stuck with me that's about the way that the child draws strength, form, nutrition from the mother. She's thinking particularly of how a child pulls from the mother's own bones to get the calcium needed to make his or her own body. And Natalie Carnes writes, "The body's sacrifices may be small and ordinary, but they can nevertheless be costly. I keep thinking about calcium. I think about my grandmother and her multiple falls, which turned into multiple breaks because she suffered from osteoporosis late in life, precipitated by having born and birthed 4 children. I think of my mother, who herself bore 3 children, watching her mother's decline and taking up weight-bearing exercises and calcium chews. We do not choose to send calcium from our bones or to make these other sacrifices of care. Our bodies simply do these things, caring for the vulnerable one within, as if charity were the grain of the universe, as if we were already a charitable people." As if charity were the grain of the universe, and as if we were already a charitable people. What's true in the relationship between mother and child is something that can set the pattern for our other relationships and for our approach to politics and all the neighbors we gain by being one nation. Need makes intimacy, an obvious intimacy in the relationship of parent and child, an unwanted intimacy in many other relationships of need. But that intimacy of need, that personal attention it takes to meet need, cannot be denied, however much we are uncomfortable with it. But we have our alternative set at our beginning. Our natality is our tutorial in unashamed need and unashamed receiving. And then we are called, each of us, born as debtors in that sense, to pass on, not just back to our parents, but on to the other vulnerable people we meet, the care that has already been offered to us, the unashamed care, undisgusted by need that has already been offered to us. What we learn at the breast, in the womb, is what we have to learn to apply at greater remove and greater abstraction. It even means it sets the pattern for how we reshape our economy, how our markets, how our businesses, how our employment responds to need. And of course, this is the system where it's easier and easier to abstract away need, to make need invisible, where financialization lets us hide our choices from our consequences. Who can enumerate for me, as George does in It's a Wonderful Life, exactly where the money in my bank account is going? Who can point to what house and what family I'm supporting, or whose debts I'm speculating on, whose need I'm profiting off of? It gets harder to make these choices of care when it comes to our economy because our choices are, by design, pushed further and further away from our attention. The tech, the complicated collateralized debt obligations have all gotten more complicated, but this isn't a problem that's so novel that we are the first people to face it, or the first people to say, I'm overmatched by these questions. It's a question that has come up again and again because it's always a temptation to build an economy that is an inhumane economy, that makes humans invisible and then gives us room to not be human to each other. But credit and debt aren't automatically bad things. They're a way at their best of creating a web of relationships, of attentiveness and care for each other. When I lend to you to support your family, I gain an interest in your family's well-being, or at least I ought to. They're a way of smoothing through rough patches, letting my surplus become your support. But again, this question of how we let it be support, not exploitation, has been with us from the beginning. In Lewis Hyde's book, The Gift, which is a fascinating meditation on both art and economics, and he marries them together so naturally it seems odd to see them split apart anywhere else. Hyde writes about why the early church spoke against usury, lending money at interest. And he says there was an issue where as people started to lend, and as people were saying, well, we need to charge interest to pay the wages and support the people who are making the loans and keeping up with them. He said that was the problem, as the early church fathers saw it. He said, this, of course, is precisely why usury had been prohibited in the first place. The spirit of the gift demands that no one make a living off another man's need. A group of people comes to be called a brotherhood not only when the circulation of gifts assures that no one has lost touch with the sources of wealth, but also when no individuals in the group can make a private living by standing in the stream where surplus wealth flows towards need. If there are always enough needy people around to feed a group of pawnbrokers, then something is seriously wrong with the brotherhood. And that passage has always stuck with me because we talk in our realism as though the concentration of wealth, the stale, flat, dead water pooling of wealth were what's natural. And what Hyde describes is a sense that that gradient, that flowing smoothly from concentration to lack is what's natural as water flowing from high space to low. And the odd thing is standing in that stream of water rushing justly down to those who need it and diverting it privately and charging people for the privilege of receiving what was coming to them, rushing to them eagerly. So when we say there has to be a counter-revolution to a culture of autonomy, are we being unrealistic? When we say there is a stream, a natural force where surplus wealth flows towards need, are we being unrealistic? When we say that our bodies already know from their very beginnings how to ask and how to receive, and we put great time, effort, and expense in educating ourselves out of this knowledge, erasing the very first thing we learn about who we are and what we owe each other, are we being unrealistic? No more so than the engineer who says, honestly, this dam cannot hold. No more unrealistic than the climatologist who says the waters are rising and this town is too low to stand the flood that's coming. No more unrealistic than Noah, who built an ark that his neighbors saw as absurdity, in faith that the world could be preserved as long as there was a place where it could be welcomed. It is as reasonable as to deny the rain when we are standing in it, as it is to deny who we are, vulnerable to the elements and to each other. Peter and Lauren are realists. They are advocating for a politics of the real, a politics of mutual dependence. And I'm very proud to be here tonight as they accept their nominations. Thank you.